There's something quietly fascinating about the history you think you know. The stories we carry around about America, the ones we learned in classrooms, the ones passed down at dinner tables, the ones repeated so many times they stopped feeling like stories and just started feeling like facts. So many of them are a little bit off. Not dramatically wrong, not invented from nothing, but gently, persistently mistaken in ways that most people never stop to question. And that's what tonight is about, not scandals, not conspiracies, just the slow, comfortable unraveling of things you probably believe that historians have quietly moved on from. The myths that textbooks kept printing long after the evidence said otherwise. The legends that survived because they were too satisfying to let go of. The oversimplifications that made complicated, messy, deeply human events feel tidy and resolved. American history is full of them. We believe things about the founding fathers that they themselves would have found strange. We carry images of the Civil War, the frontier, the World Wars, the Civil Rights Movement that are just close enough to the truth to feel accurate, but just far enough from it to quietly mislead us. We picture things that never happened quite the way we picture them. We repeat phrases that have been taken out of context for so long that the original meaning has almost completely evaporated. None of that is your fault. History is always being revised, always being reconsidered. That's not a weakness of the discipline. That's actually the sign of a healthy one. Scholars find new documents, archaeologists uncover new evidence. Perspectives that were once ignored get the attention they always deserved. And slowly, carefully, the picture gets more detailed, more accurate, more honest. Tonight, we're going to move through 99 of those moments together. 99 things that most Americans believe about their own history that turn out, on closer inspection, to be somewhere between incomplete and simply untrue. Some of them are small. A date that's slightly wrong, a name that gets misremembered, a quote that was never actually spoken by the person we've been crediting for generations. Others go a little deeper, touching the way we understand entire eras, entire movements, entire people. We'll move slowly. There's no rush. The idea is not to overwhelm you with correction after correction delivered at the pace of a quiz show. The idea is to let these things settle in gently, one at a time, the way a good book does when you're reading late at night, and every few pages something small shifts inside your understanding of the world. So if you're settling in, if the lights are low and the room is quiet, that's exactly right. This kind of history is best absorbed when you're relaxed, when there's no pressure to memorize or retain or perform. Just listen and let what's true replace what wasn't quite. We'll move through the colonial era first, those early decades on the continent that tend to get compressed into a few dramatic images that don't quite capture how complicated, how uncertain, how genuinely strange the whole enterprise actually was. Then through the Revolution, which was messier and more divided than we usually admit. Through the founding years, when the ideals we celebrate and the realities people lived existed in extraordinary tension with each other. Through the Civil War, which carries more mythology per decade than almost any other period in American life. Then westward, through the expansion years, with all the beauty and brutality that involved. Into the world wars, where the stories we tell tend to flatten enormously complicated events into clean narratives of heroism and unity. And then into the modern era, where some of the most persistent myths are the ones that feel the most recent, the ones we'd expect to have right by now simply because they happened closer to our own time. 99 items, 99 quiet corrections. Some will surprise you. Some will feel almost obvious once you hear them, the kind of thing where you think, well, of course, why did I believe that in the first place? Others might push back a little against something you've held on to for a long time, and that's fine too. Good history asks you to hold your certainties lightly, to stay curious, to let the past be as complicated as it actually was. None of what follows is meant to diminish the country or the people who shaped it. If anything, the real history, with all its contradictions and revisions and hidden details, is more interesting than the simplified version. Real people are always more interesting than monuments. Real events are always more textured than the summaries we write about them afterward. So let's begin, gently and without any hurry, at the very beginning of the American story, back before it was a country at all, back when it was a collection of colonies on an enormous continent that Europeans were still trying to understand. Because even there, in those earliest chapters, Some of the things we believe most confidently turn out to need a second look. Here are 99 things you believe about American history that are wrong. 1. Columbus proved the earth was round. This one has been circulating for so long it feels like a foundational fact, but educated Europeans already knew the earth was round centuries before Columbus ever set sail. Greek scholars had worked it out in antiquity. Medieval universities taught it. The sailors and scholars of Columbus's era were not debating the shape of the planet. What they were actually debating was the size of it. Columbus believed the earth was considerably smaller than it is, which meant he thought Asia was reachable within a reasonable voyage. He was wrong about that. He only survived the mistake because a continent he didn't know existed happened to be in the way. 2. Columbus discovered America. Millions of people were already living across the Americas when Columbus arrived in 1492. Entire civilizations, cities, trade networks, languages, histories stretching back thousands of years. Discovery is a complicated word when applied to a place full of people who had never lost it. Norse sailors also reached parts of North America roughly 5 centuries earlier, with the settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland offering clear archaeological evidence. Columbus's voyages were consequential, enormously so, but what they opened was contact between two hemispheres, not the finding of something that had been waiting to be found. 3. The Pilgrims came purely for religious freedom. The story we tell about the Pilgrims tends to be a clean one, a small group seeking the freedom to worship as they believed. And that was genuinely part of it, but the picture is more layered than that. The Pilgrims were also bound by economic arrangements with investors who expected returns. They operated within the framework of English colonial ambitions. Their motivations were tangled together in the way that most human motivations are: spiritual, practical, financial, and political all at once. The pure religious freedom story is not wrong exactly, just incomplete in ways that matter. 4. The first Thanksgiving was the beginning of an ongoing tradition. The 1621 gathering between Pilgrims and the Wampanoag is the image most Americans carry, but it was not the start of an annual tradition. It was not repeated the following year. For a long time, days of Thanksgiving were called irregularly, tied to specific events, and meant different things in different colonies. The holiday as a fixed national observance came much later. Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a national Thanksgiving in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, for reasons quite removed from harvest celebrations in Plymouth. The continuity we imagine between 1621 and the modern holiday is largely a story added afterward. 5. The Puritans came to America for religious tolerance. This is perhaps the most persistent inversion in early American history. The Puritans wanted the freedom to practice their own faith, and they found it, but they did not bring tolerance with them. Dissenters in Puritan Massachusetts faced banishment, punishment, and worse. Roger Williams was expelled for advocating separation of church and state. Anne Hutchinson was cast out for her religious views. The Puritan colonies were not experiments in open-minded pluralism. They were communities built around strict conformity to a particular vision of faith, where the freedom they sought was very specifically their own. 6. Jamestown succeeded because the colonists worked hard from the start. Jamestown's early years were a slow disaster. Disease spread through the settlement almost immediately. Hunger became severe enough that historians have documented cases of extreme desperation among the survivors. Leadership was fractured. The land the colonists chose was marshy and difficult. Survival in those early years depended heavily on trade and interaction with indigenous peoples, not on colonial self-sufficiency. The version of Jamestown as a story of industrious settlers building something from nothing skips over how close the whole venture came, repeatedly, to simply ceasing to exist. 7. Pocahontas and John Smith had a romantic relationship. The story, as most people know it, comes largely from the 1995 film, but it doesn't hold up historically. John Smith was a grown man when he arrived in Virginia. Pocahontas was a child. The famous rescue story, where she saves his life by placing her head next to his, comes only from Smith's own later account and is disputed by historians. What was real and genuinely significant was the diplomatic relationship between the English colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, a relationship that was complicated, tense, and consequential in ways that a love story quietly erases. 8. Native Americans all reacted the same way to colonists. The image of a single unified indigenous response to European arrival is one of the more flattening myths in American history. There were hundreds of distinct nations across the continent, each with their own languages, political structures, and histories with neighboring peoples. Some nations initially welcomed trade relationships with European settlers and found them strategically useful against traditional rivals. Others resisted from the earliest contact. Many pursued complex diplomatic arrangements that shifted as circumstances changed. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy negotiated carefully with multiple European powers at once, playing them against each other with considerable sophistication. Coastal nations experienced contact very differently than interior peoples who wouldn't encounter Europeans for generations. Some tribes allied with the French, some with the British, some with neither, based on calculations that had everything to do with local geography and politics, and very little to do with European expectations. Treating indigenous peoples as a single group with a single reaction erases centuries of distinct history and the real political intelligence those nations brought to an entirely new kind of challenge. 9. The Salem witch trials burned witches at the stake. Burning is the image that tends to come to mind, partly because it matches the broader European association with witch executions. But in Salem in 1692, the condemned were hanged. 19 people were executed on Gallows Hill by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, died by a different and particularly grim method. He refused to enter a plea, and under the legal practice of the time, he was pressed beneath heavy stones over the course of 2 days in an attempt to force one from him. He never gave it. Several others died in prison while awaiting trial. The burning image likely bleeds in from European witch trials and from the general sense that something so extreme must have involved fire. It didn't. The specific details of what actually happened in Salem matter, because the accurate history is already sufficiently devastating without the additions. 10. Roger Williams wanted no religion in public life. Williams is sometimes claimed as an early advocate for secularism, a colonial forerunner of strict church-state separation in the modern sense. But what he was arguing for was something more precise than that. Williams believed the church needed to be protected from the corrupting influence of the state, not that religion should be absent from civic life entirely. He founded Rhode Island as a place where people of different faiths could live and worship without government interference or punishment. That was genuinely radical for his time, but his concern was the purity and integrity of religious conscience, not the removal of faith from the public square. He welcomed Quakers, Jews, and Catholics to Rhode Island even when he disagreed profoundly with their beliefs. The distinction matters because his argument was fundamentally about protecting belief, not limiting it. 11. The colonies were united long before the Revolution. The 13 colonies are so familiar to us as a group that it's easy to imagine them always moving together, sharing purpose and identity across decades of colonial life. In reality, they spent most of their existence in fairly sharp disagreement with one another. Religious differences ran deep. New England's Congregationalist culture had almost nothing in common with Anglican Virginia's Planter Society or Quaker Pennsylvania's approach to governance. Trade rivalries created real economic friction between colonies. Local assemblies guarded their own power jealously. When Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union in 1754, a modest framework for colonial cooperation, the colonies rejected it. The coordinated resistance that eventually became the Revolution was built slowly and painfully out of people who had not naturally thought of themselves as a single people at all. The unity came late, and even then it was fragile. 12. Indentured servants were basically the same as enslaved people. Both systems involved brutal labor conditions, and both were used to build colonial wealth, which is probably why they sometimes get flattened into the same category. But the legal and human distinctions between them were fundamental. Indenture was a contract for a fixed term, typically 4 to 7 years, after which servants were legally free. They could theoretically sue in court. Their status did not pass to their children. Slavery as it developed in the American colonies became hereditary, permanent, and racial. A person born to an enslaved mother was enslaved regardless of any other circumstance. There was no contract, no end date, no legal personhood to appeal to. Indentured servitude was genuinely harsh and often deadly, and many servants did not survive their terms. But collapsing the two systems obscures the specific legal architecture of racial slavery, which was constructed deliberately and with lasting consequences. 13. The Declaration of Independence created the United States government. The Declaration is such a foundational document that it's easy to assume it did more than it actually did at the moment of its signing. What it did was announce to the world that the 13 colonies considered themselves no longer subject to British authority. It was a statement of principles and an act of separation. It did not establish a government. After independence was declared, the colonies operated under the Articles of Confederation, a loose arrangement that gave the central government very limited power. That system struggled considerably, which eventually led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The Constitution that emerged from Philadelphia, and the government it created, came more than a decade after the Declaration. The founding was not a single moment, but a long and contested process, full of disagreement, experiment, and compromise that stretched well into the 1790s. 14. Americans fought the revolution entirely alone. There is a version of the revolution that centers entirely on colonial militias, Minutemen, and citizen soldiers standing up to the British Empire through sheer determination. That story is not false, but it leaves out the partner without whom the outcome might have been very different. France entered the war formally in 1778, following the American victory at Saratoga, which provided the evidence France needed that the Continental Army could actually win. French financial support had been flowing before that, through covert channels that kept the Continental Army supplied when it had little else. Once France entered openly, the contribution became enormous. French troops fought alongside Americans at Yorktown, the engagement that effectively ended the war. The French Navy blocked British reinforcement at a critical moment in that campaign. Spanish and Dutch pressure on Britain further stretched British resources. The revolution was an international effort. The myth of going it alone is appealing, but the historical reality is that American independence was won through alliance as much as through independence. 15. Paul Revere rode alone shouting, "The British are coming." The famous Midnight Ride is usually told as a one-man drama, but the real warning system was a network. On the night of April 18, 1775, Revere was just one of several riders, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, spreading the alarm. The message itself also didn't sound like the version in schoolbooks. Many colonists still thought of themselves as British, so shouting "The British are coming" would have been confusing. Riders warned instead that the regulars or the soldiers were on the move. The story shrank in memory until one rider carried the whole narrative. 16. The Boston Tea Party protested high taxes. The image is straightforward: angry colonists furious about expensive tea. But the Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of tea in the colonies by letting the British East India Company sell directly, cutting out some middlemen. The problem wasn't the cost at all, it was the principle and the power behind it. Parliament claimed the right to tax the colonies without their consent and granted a massive trading monopoly to one favored company. The destruction of the tea was a targeted protest against political authority and corporate privilege, not simply a complaint about a household item. 17. Bunker Hill was a clear British victory. Textbook summaries often say the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 because they eventually controlled the ground. But the cost of taking that position was staggering. British troops made repeated frontal assaults up the hill and suffered over 1,000 casualties, including many officers. Colonial forces ran out of ammunition and withdrew, yet they had demonstrated that untested militia could stand up to professional soldiers and inflict severe losses. In London, the battle was a sobering warning about how hard this war might be. For many in the colonies, it was oddly encouraging, a costly loss that stiffened resolve. 18. George Washington never lost a battle. The serene portrait on the dollar bill can make Washington feel like an almost mythic general, winning every engagement through calm wisdom. The actual record is more mixed and more human. Washington lost at Long Island, White Plains, Brandywine, and Germantown. He watched New York City fall and endured retreats that could have broken a weaker command. His strength was not perfection on the battlefield, but perseverance and adaptation. He learned from his defeats, avoided being trapped, and preserved the Continental Army as a fighting force. In a war where simply not losing outright could count as progress, that endurance mattered more than an unbroken string of victories. 19. Valley Forge was mainly a tale of endless starvation. The winter encampment of 1777 to 1778 has become a symbol of pure suffering. Men without shoes, ragged tents, nothing but hunger and cold. Conditions were undoubtedly harsh, and supply failures were real. But Valley Forge was also a place of transformation. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, the Continental Army adopted standardized drills, improved discipline, and learned to maneuver as a cohesive force. Administrative reforms began to address some of the chronic logistical problems. By the time the army marched out in the spring, it was more professional and effective than the force that had arrived. Valley Forge was misery, but it was also a turning point in organization and competence. 20. The revolution was supported by all colonists. It is tempting to imagine a continent moving in unison, farmers and merchants and planters all equally committed to independence. The reality on the ground was far more fractured. A significant portion of the population remained loyal to the crown, for reasons ranging from economic ties and religious convictions to fear of instability. Others tried to stay neutral, simply wanting to survive whatever came. In some regions, especially in the South, the war resembled a civil conflict among neighbors as much as a rebellion against a distant king. Property was seized, families divided, communities torn apart. The revolution was not a unanimous chorus, but a contested choice with many people pulled along unwillingly. 21. The revolution ended at Yorktown. The surrender of British forces at Yorktown in 1781 makes a tidy endpoint, with drums, formal ceremony, and a sense of completion. But wars end on paper as well as on fields. After Yorktown, scattered fighting and skirmishes continued, particularly at sea and on the frontiers. Negotiations in Europe stretched on for nearly 2 years. It was the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that formally recognized American independence, set boundaries, and addressed issues like debts and the status of loyalists. Only then did the legal state of war truly conclude. The space between the last major battle and the signed peace was filled with uncertainty, diplomacy, and the slow work of turning a military victory into an actual country. 22. The founders all agreed about liberty. It's easy to picture the men of the founding era gathered in perfect philosophical harmony, nodding together about freedom and rights. They did share some broad language about liberty, but beneath those words were sharp disagreements. Alexander Hamilton favored a strong central government and energetic executive power. Thomas Jefferson worried about centralized authority and dreamed of a republic of small farmers. John Adams distrusted pure democracy and feared majority passion. James Madison obsessed over how to restrain factions and prevent any group from dominating. On slavery, they were even more divided. Some wanted gradual abolition, others defended the institution. Many tried to avoid the question. The result was not a single shared vision of liberty, but a fragile compromise among competing ones. 23. The Constitution was written to expand direct democracy. The usual story says the revolution brought independence, and the Constitution then gave power straight to the people. The framers did believe in popular legitimacy, but they were also deeply suspicious of unchecked majority rule. The Constitution created the House of Representatives elected directly by voters, but it also built in buffers. Senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, not the public. The president would be selected by an electoral college, not a national vote. Federal judges would be appointed, not elected, and serve for life. Property rules and state laws further limited who could vote in the first place. The document was designed as much to slow, filter, and restrain popular impulses as to express them. It was a cautious system, not a pure democracy. 24. The Founding Fathers created a purely Christian nation. Modern rhetoric sometimes imagines the United States as officially founded on one specific religious tradition. The actual text of the Constitution tells a quieter story. It contains no references to Christianity, Jesus, or the Bible. It never declares an official church. Instead, it includes a brief but clear statement in Article 6. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. The First Amendment, added soon after, bars Congress from establishing a religion or prohibiting its free exercise. Many founders were personally religious, others were deists with more distant views of the divine. They argued about theology and morality, but when it came to government, they placed faith under a protective layer of neutrality, not a formal national creed. 25. The Bill of Rights was part of the original Constitution. The familiar first 10 amendments feel so foundational that it's easy to assume they were woven in from the beginning. In 1787, though, the proposed Constitution went to the states without any explicit Bill of Rights. This absence became a major point of criticism. Anti-federalists worried that without clear protections, the new federal government could trample speech, religion, and due process. Federalists argued that enumerating rights might imply other rights did not exist. Ratification debates in several states turned on this question, and some states demanded amendments as a condition of approval. James Madison, who had once doubted the need, drafted a set of rights in response. These became the first 10 amendments, ratified in 1791. The Bill of Rights was not an original feature, but an early important revision. 26. George Washington had wooden teeth. This image of Washington struggling with splintery dentures is so common that it feels like a quirky historical detail. In reality, none of his known dental sets were made of wood. Surviving examples show combinations of ivory from animals, like hippopotamus or elephant, human teeth purchased or taken from donors, and metal components of gold, lead, and springs. The materials stained and cracked over time, which may have given a dull, grainy appearance that later stories turned into wood. Washington did suffer from serious dental problems. He lost teeth throughout his life, endured painful procedures, and often spoke and posed carefully to hide his discomfort. The myth of wooden teeth simplifies a more complicated and more human experience of chronic pain in 18th century medicine. 27. Alexander Hamilton was a president. His face on the $10 bill and his central role in the new government can blur into the assumption that he must have held the top office. Hamilton never served as president. His most powerful formal role was as the first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. In that position, he shaped the young nation's finances, proposing the federal assumption of state debts, creating a system of public credit, and helping establish a national bank. Informally, his influence extended far beyond his title. He advised Washington closely, wrote key policy papers, and helped define the Federalist Party. His vision favored commerce, manufacturing, and strong central authority. But the presidency itself eluded him. Political enemies, personal scandals, and his own temperament kept him out of that office, even as his ideas deeply affected those who did hold it. 28. Thomas Jefferson alone wrote the Declaration. The clean version of the story shows Jefferson sitting down, drafting the Declaration of Independence in one solitary burst of inspiration, and handing it to history. Jefferson was indeed chosen by a small committee to prepare the first draft. He drew on earlier colonial documents, Enlightenment thinkers, and existing resolutions. But once his draft reached the Continental Congress, it entered the realm of group editing. Delegates debated phrases, cut entire passages, and softened or removed some of Jefferson's more pointed language, including a harsh condemnation of the slave trade. The final document was the product of collective revision, compromise, and political calculation. Jefferson remained proud of his authorship, yet the declaration that was adopted and signed was not solely his voice, but the adjusted, negotiated voice of a Congress trying to stay united. 29. The Constitution immediately ended disputes over federal power. Once the Constitution was ratified, it's tempting to imagine everyone agreeing on what it meant and how strong the new federal government should be. In reality, the ink was barely dry before arguments over states' rights and federal authority began. The fight over the national bank in the 1790s was one of the first big tests. Hamilton argued that Congress had implied powers to create a bank. Jefferson and Madison insisted that if a power wasn't listed, the federal government didn't have it. The Whiskey Rebellion raised questions about how far federal power could reach into local communities. Later, disputes over tariffs, internal improvements, and slavery all turned on different readings of the same document. The Constitution did not settle the debate over power. It gave Americans a framework in which to keep arguing about it. 30. The Electoral College was designed for modern party elections. When we look at today's presidential campaigns, with national parties, primaries, and carefully targeted swing states, it's easy to assume the framers built the Electoral College for this world. They didn't. When the system was created in 1787, there were no formal national political parties. Many delegates actually hoped parties would never develop. The Electoral College was imagined as a group of wise, independent electors, chosen within each state, who would calmly deliberate and select suitable candidates. Instead, parties formed almost immediately. By the election of 1800, tightly organized party slates were coordinating elector choices. The tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr exposed how poorly the original design fit partisan reality. The 12th Amendment adjusted the rules, but the basic structure remained. The Electoral College we live with today is a repurposed mechanism, adapted awkwardly to a party system its designers did not foresee. 31. Marbury v. Madison created all judicial power from nothing. The 1803 case of Marbury v. Madison is often taught as the moment when the Supreme Court suddenly grabbed new authority out of thin air. The decision was important. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the court could strike down acts of Congress that violated the Constitution, a power we now call judicial review. But judges hadn't been powerless before. Colonial and early state courts had already been interpreting laws, resolving conflicts, and, in some cases, refusing to enforce statutes they thought clashed with higher principles or charters. The Constitution itself assumed that courts would apply and interpret its provisions. Marbury did not invent the idea that judges have meaningful authority. It clarified, in a dramatic and carefully staged way, that federal courts could declare laws unconstitutional, and that this role was part of the normal functioning of the constitutional system, not an extra power seized from nowhere. 32. The Louisiana Purchase was clearly constitutional to Jefferson. The story can sound simple. Thomas Jefferson wanted Western land, negotiated with France, and confidently bought the Louisiana Territory. In truth, the purchase left him uneasy. Jefferson had long insisted on a strict reading of the Constitution, arguing that the federal government only had the powers explicitly listed. The document said nothing directly about buying vast territories from foreign nations. Privately, Jefferson worried that the deal went beyond what the Constitution permitted. He even drafted a possible amendment to authorize the acquisition more clearly. In the end, he set aside those doubts. The opportunity was too significant to ignore, and his advisors argued that the treaty-making power was broad enough to cover the purchase. The Louisiana Purchase became one of his greatest achievements, but it also marked a quiet moment when Jefferson bent his own principles about limited federal power. 33. The War of 1812 was basically a second American Revolution. It's common to hear the War of 1812 described as a simple replay of the struggle for independence, a second round of America versus Britain for freedom. The reality was more tangled. The United States did resent British interference with its maritime trade, especially the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy. But the war also involved conflicts along the frontier, where native nations fought to defend their lands, sometimes as British allies. American leaders saw the war as a chance to assert national honor, secure the borders, and possibly expand into Canada. The war's outcomes were mixed. Washington, D.C. was burned, New Orleans was defended, and the Treaty of Ghent largely restored pre-war boundaries. The sense of national pride that followed was real, yet the conflict was about maritime rights, regional ambitions, and territorial struggles, not a simple repeat of the Revolution's bid for independence. 34. The Star-Spangled Banner celebrated a great American victory. The national anthem's soaring words and familiar melody can make it feel like a triumphant celebration of overwhelming success. Francis Scott Key wrote the poem in 1814 while watching the British bombard Fort McHenry near Baltimore. The victory he described was, more quietly, a survival. The Americans held the fort. The flag was still flying in the morning. Baltimore did not fall, but the broader war around it remained uncertain. The United States had suffered humiliations, including the capture and burning of Washington. Peace negotiations were already underway in Europe. The Treaty of Ghent, signed later that year, ended the war without major territorial changes. The Star-Spangled Banner captured a moment of endurance and relief during a conflict that ended largely inconclusively. It did not mark a decisive turning point on the battlefield so much as a symbolic reassurance that the young republic was still standing. 35. Andrew Jackson was a champion of the common man for everyone. Jacksonian democracy is often remembered as the great opening of American politics to ordinary people, sweeping away elites in favor of rough-hewn frontier equality. Jackson did expand participation for many white men, as property requirements fell and voter turnout rose. He cast himself as the people's tribune against banks and entrenched interests. But his version of the people was sharply limited. Enslaved people had no place in his political vision except as property. Free Black Americans faced increasing restrictions. Women remained excluded from formal politics. Above all, Jackson's rise coincided with, and helped drive, aggressive expansion into native homelands. His support for the Indian Removal Act led to forced relocations like the Trail of Tears. He also concentrated power in the presidency, using the veto more than his predecessors. His populism uplifted some while inflicting deep harm on others, and strengthened executive authority in ways that worried even his allies. 36. The Trail of Tears was one single march. The phrase Trail of Tears sounds like it refers to one tragic journey, one terrible episode you can put on a timeline and then move past. In reality, it describes a series of forced removals of multiple southeastern native nations over many years. The Cherokee removal in the late 1830s is the most famous, but they were not alone. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples were also pushed from their homelands under the Indian Removal Act. Each nation had its own treaties, its own leaders, its own routes west. Some went by river, some by overland paths, some in winter marches where disease and exposure killed thousands. Others were forced into makeshift camps before the journeys even began. Families were separated, graves, farms, and towns were left behind. The Trail of Tears is not a single road through history. It's a shorthand for a broad, deliberate policy that uprooted entire societies from the southeast to what became Oklahoma. 37. Manifest Destiny was universally accepted. Schoolbook versions can make Manifest Destiny sound like a calm, shared national belief that the United States was obviously meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The slogan itself emerged in the 1840s, but the idea of expansion had been around longer. Even then, it was not embraced by everyone. Many Americans did support territorial growth, seeing it as opportunity, security, or divine plan. Others were uneasy or outright opposed. Some northern politicians worried that new land would mean new slave states, tilting power toward the South. Some feared that distant territories would be expensive to govern and might drag the country into wars. Religious and moral critics argued that dispossessing native peoples and provoking conflicts with Mexico violated Christian principles. There were also practical skeptics who doubted that a republic could stay stable while sprawling over such distances. Manifest Destiny was never a unanimous marching order. It was a contested slogan in a country already arguing with itself. 38. The Alamo defenders fought for modern democratic equality. The stand at the Alamo is often framed as a simple fight for freedom against tyranny, with brave Texans defending universal liberty. The truth of the Texas Revolution is more complicated. Many of the American-born settlers in Mexican Texas had moved there with enslaved people, despite Mexico's efforts to limit or abolish slavery. The Mexican government had outlawed the international slave trade and, in theory, slavery itself, though enforcement was uneven. As Mexico tried to tighten control, restrict new slavery, and collect customs duties, some Anglo settlers saw these moves as threats to their economic system and way of life. They complained about lack of local autonomy and representation, and they also resisted Mexican legal limits on slavery. The defenders at the Alamo included people with different motives, from land and security to abstract ideals of self-rule, but the cause of Texas independence was entangled with the desire to maintain and expand slavery beyond Mexican restrictions. 39. The Mexican-American War was an unprovoked defense of Texas. A comforting version says the United States was simply protecting Texas from Mexican aggression, responding to a clear attack. The border, we're told, was fixed and obvious, and Mexico struck first without reason. In fact, the situation along the Rio Grande was deliberately inflamed. Mexico had never accepted Texas independence and still considered the Nueces River farther north as the boundary. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, it also embraced Texas's claim to a larger border at the Rio Grande. President James K. Polk sent troops into this disputed strip, fully aware that Mexico saw it as its own territory. Skirmishes followed. Polk then used the clashes to declare that American blood had been shed on American soil, even though whose soil it was remained contested. Many contemporary Americans, including Abraham Lincoln and other Whigs, criticized the war as a war of choice, fueled by expansionist ambitions and the desire of slaveholding interests for new land. 40. The California gold rush made most miners rich. The image of the gold rush is glittering, hopeful prospectors striking it rich with a lucky pan, or a single vein of quartz. In reality, most people who rushed to California in 1849 and the early 1850s did not become wealthy. Many barely covered their costs or returned home with less than they started. Simple surface gold was quickly claimed. As mining required more capital, equipment, and organization, individual prospectors found themselves competing with larger companies. The people who consistently made money were often those who sold goods and services: merchants, innkeepers, transport companies, suppliers of tools and food. San Francisco boomed as a commercial hub. Prices were wildly inflated, and fortunes could be made in trade rather than in streams and hills. The gold rush did transform California's population and economy, but the classic story of the lone miner striking it big was the exception, not the rule. For many, the dream of easy wealth stayed just out of reach. 41. The frontier was mostly empty land. The phrase "the frontier" can conjure an image of untouched wilderness, open for the taking, waiting patiently for pioneers to arrive. This picture erases the reality that Western lands were already home to millions of people and long-established societies. Indigenous nations across the continent had complex political systems, trade networks, agriculture, and sacred landscapes. In places like California, New Mexico, and Texas, there were also long-standing Spanish and Mexican communities with towns, missions, and ranches. Far from being blank space, the West was a patchwork of claims, treaties, and relationships that settlers had to navigate or override. The U.S. government negotiated, broke, and rewrote numerous treaties to open land to white settlement. Conflicts erupted as these existing residents resisted dispossession. Calling it empty served a purpose. It made it easier to imagine that new arrivals were improving unused space, rather than displacing people whose roots there were centuries deep. 42. The Underground Railroad was an actual railroad. The name sounds literal enough that it's easy to picture hidden train tracks and secret locomotives rushing people north. In truth, the Underground Railroad had no rails and no trains. It was a loose, shifting network of people, routes, safe houses, and strategies that helped enslaved people escape bondage. The language of railroads was used as code. Conductors were guides. Stations or depots were homes or churches where fugitives could rest. Passengers were the people fleeing slavery. The network crossed state lines and even national borders, leading into free states, Canada, and, in some cases, Mexico or the Caribbean. Many of the people who operated this quiet system were black, both free and formerly enslaved, working alongside some white abolitionists. Routes were improvised, adjusted constantly to avoid capture. There was no central organization, no master blueprint. The Underground Railroad was less an engineered system than a shared commitment, carried out in secrecy, to help people reclaim their own freedom. 43. Harriet Tubman freed hundreds personally in constant raids. The legend of Harriet Tubman often says she led hundreds of slaves to freedom, with some versions giving numbers in the hundreds or even 1,000 people she personally guided. The truth is no less impressive, just more precise. Historians estimate that Tubman directly led about 70 people out of slavery on the Underground Railroad, mostly family members and close contacts, in a series of dangerous trips between Maryland and the North. She also gave instructions, contacts, and strategies to many others who escaped without her physically being there, and in that broader sense, she helped well over 100 people. During the Civil War, she served as a nurse, scout, and spy for the Union Army, and even helped lead a military raid in South Carolina that freed more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. The myth of hundreds personally compresses all of this into one image. The reality is a lifetime of steady, repeated courage, planning, and service, not a single dramatic number. 44. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and ended slavery's need. A common classroom story ties Eli Whitney's cotton gin to the eventual end of slavery, as if his machine made human bondage obsolete. The cotton gin, patented in 1794, did make it easier to separate cotton fibers from seeds, vastly speeding up one step of production. Instead of reducing the demand for enslaved labor, it did the opposite. By making cotton processing more efficient, the gin made cotton farming much more profitable. Planters in the American South responded by expanding cotton cultivation into new territories, buying more land and purchasing more enslaved people to plant, tend, and harvest the crop. Cotton exports soared, and with them, the economic entrenchment of slavery. The Cotton Kingdom stretched across the Deep South in these years, tied to global markets and northern textile mills. Rather than weakening slavery, Whitney's invention helped lock it in as the backbone of the Southern economy. The machine reduced a task, it did not reduce the system that exploited human beings. 45. The North opposed slavery uniformly. It is tempting to imagine a clean map, with a morally enlightened North standing firmly against slavery and a cruel South defending it. The reality is more complicated and less comforting. Many northern states did move earlier toward gradual emancipation, and there were strong abolitionist communities in places like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and parts of Ohio and New York. But opposition to slavery did not always mean belief in racial equality, and it did not always translate into support for black rights. Many white Northerners opposed slavery's expansion because they did not want to compete with enslaved labor or live near black people at all. Free soil for white workers was a common slogan. Northern ports and factories also profited from the slave economy through shipping, banking, and textile manufacturing. Racist laws, segregated schools, and violent attacks on black communities existed in northern cities. The North was not a unified block of moral clarity. It was a region with its own deep prejudices, divisions, and contradictions around race and freedom. 46. The Civil War began only because Lincoln was elected. A simplified version of events says the South was content until Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, and his election suddenly triggered war. Lincoln's victory was a catalyst, but it was not the root cause. Conflicts over slavery had been building for decades. The Missouri Compromise, the gag rule in Congress, the Mexican-American War and its aftermath, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid. Each episode reflected the same underlying struggle over whether slavery would expand, be contained, or eventually end. Southern leaders saw Lincoln and the Republican Party as a threat because their platform opposed the spread of slavery into new territories, even if Lincoln initially promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. Secession conventions across the South cited fears about slavery's future, not tariffs or abstract principles alone. Lincoln's election was the moment many Southern politicians chose to act, but the powder keg had been filled long before. 47. The Civil War was mainly about states' rights. This phrase, states' rights, is often used as a gentle, abstract explanation for secession, as if the war was a neutral constitutional disagreement that happened to involve slavery on the side. When you read the secession documents that Southern states themselves wrote, a different picture appears. Declarations from South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas repeatedly named slavery as the key issue. They complained that northern states are refusing to enforce fugitive slave laws, that abolitionist ideas threaten their property, and that the federal government might someday limit or abolish slavery. The rights they were most concerned with preserving were the right to own, sell, and control enslaved people, and to take that system into new territories. There were certainly arguments about federal power, but they were anchored in this specific institution. After the war, some people emphasized states' rights to soften the memory of secession's cause. The documents written at the time are quieter but very clear. They place slavery at the center. 48. Most Civil War soldiers died in battle. The iconic images of the Civil War are battlefields, Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, men lined up in smoke and fire. It's easy to assume that most of the war's enormous death toll came directly from combat. In reality, disease killed more soldiers than bullets or shells. Camps were crowded and often unsanitary. Knowledge of germs and infection was limited. Dysentery, typhoid fever, pneumonia, malaria, and other illnesses spread quickly through regiments. Poor diet, exposure to weather, and inadequate medical care made soldiers vulnerable. Tents were close together, latrines were badly placed, and drinking water was easily contaminated. Amputations and other surgeries were performed without modern antiseptics, leading to deadly infections. Historians estimate that for every soldier killed in battle, roughly 2 died of disease. The war's human cost was not only on the front lines, but also in hospitals, field camps, and temporary barracks where men suffered far from the famous charges and cannon fire remembered in stories. 49. Lincoln immediately wanted full racial equality. Abraham Lincoln is often remembered through his greatest words, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural. It can create the impression that he always held a modern view of racial equality from the very beginning of his career. His actual journey was slower and more conflicted. Early in his life and political career, Lincoln criticized slavery as morally wrong, but did not yet advocate for full social and political equality between black and white Americans. He sometimes supported ideas like colonization, the resettlement of freed black people outside the United States, which many black leaders firmly rejected. As the Civil War progressed, the realities of the conflict, the actions of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, and the service of black soldiers in the Union Army pushed his thinking further. By the end of the war, he endorsed limited black suffrage and spoke more clearly about a new birth of freedom. His views evolved under pressure of events and relationships. The myth of instant, complete enlightenment overlooks this gradual human change. 50. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all enslaved people instantly. The image is dramatic. Lincoln signs a document, and chains fall away across the entire South in a single moment. The actual Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, was more limited and more legalistic than that. It applied only to areas in rebellion against the United States, which meant Confederate-held territory, and not the border slave states that had stayed in the Union, like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. It also did not free enslaved people in parts of the Confederacy already under firm Union control, such as parts of Tennessee and Louisiana. On the ground, in places still held by Confederate armies, the proclamation could not be enforced until Union troops arrived. Freedom there came county by county, plantation by plantation, as Union forces advanced and as enslaved people took action to claim the promise on paper. The proclamation did transform the war's purpose and allowed black men to enlist, but its full effect depended on Union victory and, later, the 13th Amendment. It was a turning point, not an instant universal release. 51. The Gettysburg Address was poorly received and unimportant. A common story says that when Lincoln gave his short speech at Gettysburg in November 1863, the crowd was unimpressed. The newspapers mocked him, and only later did people realize its greatness. The record is gentler and more mixed. Some newspapers, especially Democratic ones hostile to Lincoln, did belittle the address, calling it silly or trivial. Others praised it right away, noting its solemn tone and concise power. Many listeners on the battlefield that day simply stood quietly, absorbing a brief speech after a much longer oration by Edward Everett. The address itself did not change the course of the war, but over time it came to symbolize something larger, a redefinition of the nation as dedicated to a new birth of freedom, and the principle that all men are created equal. School children memorized it, leaders quoted it, and it entered civic rituals. The Gettysburg Address did not begin as a universally hailed masterpiece, nor was it irrelevant. It grew into a central statement of American purpose, recognized slowly, as generations returned to its simple, careful words. 52. Black soldiers played only a minor role in the Civil War. For a long time, popular images of the Civil War showed almost exclusively white soldiers in blue and gray, as if black people were passive observers of their own fate. In reality, nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army, along with about 20,000 in the Navy, after federal policy finally allowed their enlistment on a large scale. They fought in regiments known as United States Colored Troops, or USCT, and in famous units like the 54th Massachusetts. They served in battles from Fort Wagner to the Crater, from the Mississippi Valley to the Carolina coast. Their presence freed up white troops for other fronts, garrisoned key positions, and brought vital manpower to a war that had become a grinding test of endurance. They did this while facing unequal pay for much of the conflict, harsher treatment if captured, and deep racism within the very army they served. Enslaved people also weakened the Confederacy by fleeing to Union lines, sabotaging labor, and passing information. Black participation was not a footnote to the war. It was one of the forces that made Union victory possible, and it shaped the arguments for citizenship and rights that followed. 53. Appomattox ended all Civil War fighting immediately. The scene at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 is often treated as the tidy full stop at the end of the war, with Lee handing over his sword and everyone going home at once. What actually happened was more gradual and uneven. When Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, it effectively ended major Confederate resistance in the Eastern Theater and sent a powerful symbolic signal. But other Confederate forces were still in the field. General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina did not surrender until later in April. Confederate troops west of the Mississippi held out into May. A few scattered skirmishes and raids continued even after that, as news traveled slowly and some units hesitated to accept defeat. The last Confederate raider, the ship CSS Shenandoah, did not lower its flag and surrender until November 1865, months after Appomattox. For enslaved people, too, the end of war and the arrival of freedom were staggered events, tied to the movements of soldiers and the enforcement of new laws. Appomattox was a turning point and a powerful symbol, but not a magical moment when all conflicts ceased at once. 54. Reconstruction was simply a punitive Northern occupation. In many later tellings, Reconstruction becomes a story of vengeful Northern politicians and soldiers imposing harsh rule on a defeated, innocent South, until redemption supposedly restored normal life. That version leaves out large parts of what Reconstruction actually did. After the war, federal authority and new state governments worked, imperfectly and unevenly, to transform a society built on slavery. The period saw the creation of public school systems across much of the South, which educated black and white children for the first time on a broad scale. Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, defining national citizenship, and protecting voting rights for black men on paper. Black Southerners held public office in local, state, and federal government. Interracial political coalitions wrote new constitutions that expanded rights and restructured labor laws. There was corruption, conflict, and resistance, as in any major political upheaval, and there were also federal troops present at times to enforce new laws and protect freed people. But Reconstruction was not only about punishment. It was a short, fragile experiment in building a more equal democracy in the South, one that was violently dismantled long before it could fully take root. 55. The Ku Klux Klan was a fringe local nuisance at first. The origin story often says the Klan began as a small, almost playful social club for ex-Confederate officers in Pulaski, Tennessee, and only later turned serious. Even in its early years, though, the Klan was more than a local prank. By the late 1860s, it had spread across much of the South as a clandestine network of night riders, using terror to undermine Reconstruction governments and to control black communities. Klansmen targeted black voters, teachers, ministers, and white allies who supported racial equality, whipping, beating, and murdering them to drive them from polling places and office. They burned churches and schools, left threatening notices, and enforced a regime of fear meant to restore white supremacy, without openly re-establishing slavery. The Klan did not operate as a single centralized army, but as many linked groups sharing symbols, rituals, and aims. The federal government eventually responded with enforcement acts and prosecutions in the early 1870s, which weakened the original Klan. Its methods and spirit, however, re-emerged in later organizations and in everyday violence. From the beginning, it functioned as a paramilitary arm of those opposed to black citizenship, not just a rowdy local club gone slightly too far. 56. The Gilded Age was a time of universal prosperity. The phrase Gilded Age, borrowed from Mark Twain, itself hints that something shiny on the surface may be hiding less pleasant realities underneath. Popular memory sometimes treats the late 19th century as an uncomplicated time of progress. Railroads spanning the continent, towering mansions, new inventions transforming daily life. There was indeed enormous economic growth and the rise of powerful industrial and financial fortunes. But prosperity was not evenly shared. For many workers, the period meant long hours in factories, mines, and sweatshops for low pay and unsafe conditions. Child labor was widespread. Immigrant and black workers often faced the hardest jobs with the least protection. Cities grew rapidly, with overcrowded tenements and limited sanitation. Political life was marked by patronage, graft, and close ties between business interests and government officials. Labor unrest flared in strikes and protests, from the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 to the Haymarket Affair and Pullman Strike. Farmers struggled with debt and unstable prices. The gap between the richest and the rest widened sharply. The Gilded Age did bring technological wonders and new wealth, but it was also an era of deep inequality and conflict over what kind of society that new economy was creating. 57. Robber barons were all self-made industrial geniuses. The familiar legend tells us that men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Morgan rose from nothing purely by brilliance and hard work, competing fairly in an open market and winning because they were simply better. There were certainly cases of real talent, long hours, and shrewd decision-making. But their rise was not just a clean story of genius meeting opportunity. It also involved massive government support, friendly laws, and hard-edged tactics that squeezed out rivals. Railroad magnates received huge land grants and subsidies from Congress and state legislatures. Banks and corporations enjoyed favorable court decisions that strengthened their power. Many big fortunes were built through consolidation, buying up competitors, forming trusts and pools, fixing prices, and quietly agreeing not to undercut one another in certain regions. Political influence played a central role. Industrialists funded campaigns, placed allies in regulatory bodies, and lobbied for tariffs and contracts that protected their interests. Workers, meanwhile, often saw wage cuts, long hours, and violent strike-breaking. The self-made genius story leaves out the web of subsidies, legal privileges, and ruthless consolidation that turned ambitious businessmen into towering captains of industry. 58. The Transcontinental Railroad was built mostly by white cowboys and pioneers. The popular image focuses on rugged white Americans swinging hammers against a backdrop of wide-open plains, a kind of rolling Western adventure on steel tracks. In reality, the labor force was far more diverse, and much of the most dangerous work was done by people who were not later celebrated. On the Central Pacific Line, building eastward from California, thousands of Chinese laborers carried out blasting, grading, and track laying through the Sierra Nevada and across the desert. They hung in baskets over cliffs to plant explosives, tunneled through solid rock, and dug in brutal winter storms. Many died in accidents, avalanches, and explosions. On the Union Pacific Line, moving west from the plains, large numbers of Irish immigrants, along with other European workers and some black laborers, did the heavy lifting. They drove spikes, laid ties, and graded roadbeds under harsh conditions, often in isolated camps with poor sanitation and frequent disease. Wages were low, hours were long, and company discipline was strict. The ceremonial photograph at Promontory Summit in 1869 mostly shows white officials and foremen. The Chinese and Irish workers who made the moment possible stand at the edges of the frame, or entirely outside it, their part in the story minimized for generations. 59. The Wild West was nonstop shootouts and lawlessness. Western movies and dime novels have given us a West where every town has daily gunfights, every saloon is a powder keg, and every street is ruled by outlaws. There were certainly violent episodes, infamous robberies, and memorable gunfights, but they were not the ordinary rhythm of daily life for most people. Many cattle towns and mining camps quickly adopted local regulations to keep the peace, including weapons ordinances that required visitors to check their guns with the sheriff when they entered town. Town councils hired marshals, formed juries, and created simple courts. A lot of Wild West communities worried more about fires, disease, and economic survival than about dueling in the streets. Violence did occur, but it was unevenly distributed in time and place. Some frontier areas experienced intense conflict, especially near contested land, mining claims, or cattle routes. Much of that violence also fell on indigenous communities, Chinese immigrants, Mexican Americans, and black settlers, whose suffering rarely made it into the heroic tales. For many Western residents, life meant farming, trading, church meetings, and school days, not constant gunfire. The myth of endless lawlessness exaggerates the chaos and understates the efforts people made to build stable communities. 60. Cowboys were mostly white Americans. The classic cowboy in novels and films is almost always a white man in a wide-brimmed hat, riding the range alone with his lasso. Actual cattle country was more mixed. The very word vaquero comes from Spanish, and Mexican cattle workers developed many of the techniques and tools that later became associated with cowboys in general: roping methods, saddles, spurs, and riding styles. After the Civil War, as the cattle industry expanded, black men who had been enslaved or who were newly freed found work on ranches and trail drives. Historians estimate that perhaps 1 in 4 cowboys in some regions were black. There were also indigenous cowboys who combined traditional skills with ranch work, and Mexican-American vaqueros who had long histories with cattle raising. Life as a cowboy was grueling: long hours on the trail, exposure to the elements, low pay, and seasonal uncertainty. It was a working-class job, not a glamorous adventure. Later storytellers simplified that reality, centering white characters and pushing everyone else to the edges of the frame. The real cattle frontiers were multi-ethnic places, shaped by traditions from Mexico, Africa, Europe, and native nations braided together in the open ranges and small ranch towns of the West. 61. Custer made a heroic last stand against overwhelming savagery. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is often framed as a dramatic tale of a brave officer and his men cut down by a faceless horde, a doomed but noble final stand. The view from native communities and from modern scholarship is very different. In 1876, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders were resisting U.S. efforts to confine them to reservations and seize more of their lands, especially after gold was found in the Black Hills, a region guaranteed to the Lakota by treaty. When Custer and the 7th Cavalry attacked a large native encampment along the Little Bighorn River, they were not defending a peaceful frontier. They were part of a larger campaign to force native people off their homelands and to break their independence. Native warriors fought to defend their families and territory, and they did so effectively, outmaneuvering Custer's divided command and inflicting a decisive defeat. The battle became known among native people as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, a rare moment of victory in a long struggle against dispossession. In later American storytelling, the native warriors were often portrayed as anonymous savages and Custer as a romantic martyr. In truth, the encounter was a clash between U.S. expansion and native resistance, in which native leaders briefly turned back a campaign aimed at ending their way of life. 62. The Homestead Act gave Western land freely to anyone who wanted it. The story is simple and appealing. The government opened the frontier, hardy settlers claimed a plot, and with some honest labor they owned their own farms, transforming themselves into independent landowners overnight. The Homestead Act of 1862 did make land available, but it was not as easy or as universally accessible as the legend suggests. Claimants had to file applications, pay small fees, and then prove up over 5 years by living on the land and making specific improvements like building a dwelling and cultivating fields. The work was demanding, and many homesteaders failed to meet the requirements or abandoned their claims under harsh weather, isolation, or debt. Large swaths of land were also claimed indirectly by railroads, timber interests, and land speculators who used legal loopholes, hired stand-ins to file claims, or bought up homesteads once settlers gave up. Many indigenous nations had their lands carved up and redistributed without their consent, with the Homestead Act layered atop earlier displacement. Some groups, including many Black Americans and immigrants, did manage to use homesteading to secure land, but obstacles like discrimination, lack of capital, and distance made it harder. The act did not simply hand out free farms to anyone who asked. It created a complicated path that advantaged some and left others behind, while accelerating the transfer of native land into private hands and corporate holdings. 63. The Statue of Liberty was always a symbol of immigration at Ellis Island. Today it is hard to separate the statue from images of crowded steamships, hopeful families, and the words "Give me your tired, your poor," as if it was built from the start to greet newcomers. The statue's original meaning, however, centered more on liberty, republican government, and the friendship between France and the United States after the Civil War. When it was dedicated in 1886, speeches emphasized political freedom and the end of slavery, not immigration. The famous poem by Emma Lazarus, The New Colossus, which calls the statue the Mother of Exiles, was written in 1883 to help raise funds for the pedestal, but it was not immediately central to the statue's identity. For decades, the poem remained relatively obscure. Ellis Island, the major federal immigration station, did not even open until 1892, years after the statue's unveiling. Over time, as millions of immigrants passed through New York Harbor, the towering figure on Liberty Island naturally took on a new emotional role as a sign of arrival and hope. In the early 20th century, and especially during later debates over immigration and refugees, people returned to Lazarus's words, inscribed them at the base, and wove them into the national story. The Statue of Liberty became a powerful symbol of welcome, but that meaning grew gradually, shaped by public memory and new generations of arrivals looking up at her torch. 64. Ellis Island processed most immigrants to America. When we picture immigration to the United States, we usually imagine a single gateway, Ellis Island, a funnel through which almost every family story supposedly passes. The reality is more scattered, and it stretches over centuries. Before Ellis Island opened in 1892, millions of people arrived through other ports. In the early Republic and much of the 19th century, state and local governments, not the federal government, handled immigration. New York's Castle Garden served as a major processing station from the 1850s to 1890, and long before that, ships arrived and passengers simply disembarked into city life. Other ports were also significant. Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Orleans each saw large flows of immigrants, especially from Germany, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. On the Pacific coast, San Francisco and other harbors processed Asian immigrants, many of whom never passed near Ellis Island. Even after Ellis Island opened, not everyone went through it. First- and second-class passengers were often inspected on board and admitted directly at the piers. Canadian and Mexican border crossings also facilitated quiet streams of newcomers. Ellis Island did process over 12 million people in its years of operation, and for many it became a powerful symbol, but it was never the sole or universal gateway into the United States. 65. The Spanish-American War was fought mainly to free Cuba. Textbook summaries often framed the conflict of 1898 as a noble rescue mission, the United States stepping in to support Cuban patriots against Spanish colonial rule, moved by humanitarian concern for suffering civilians. Sympathy for Cubans was real. Reports of Spanish reconcentration camps, where many civilians died from disease and hunger, horrified American observers. Cuban rebels had long sought independence, and there was genuine public support for their cause. But the reasons the United States went to war were more tangled than a simple desire to liberate a neighbor. Strategic interests mattered. American leaders saw Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as key points in a broader plan for naval bases, coaling stations, and trade routes. Influential figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that sea power and overseas possessions were essential to national greatness. Economic motives also played a role. American investors had deep interest in Cuban sugar and other commodities. Meanwhile, sensationalist newspapers in New York fanned war fever with lurid stories, dramatizing Spanish atrocities and stirring public anger. Politicians worried about domestic unrest and saw war as a unifying project. In the end, the United States did oust Spain, but then kept significant control over Cuba, annexed Puerto Rico and Guam, and claimed the Philippines. The war marked a step toward American empire as much as a mission of liberation. 66. The main explosion was proven Spanish sabotage. The oft-repeated tale is simple. The battleship USS Maine was peacefully anchored in Havana Harbor when Spanish agents blew it up, killing American sailors and providing a clear, outraging cause for war. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry, and in many memories it rests on the assumption that Spain was unquestionably guilty. At the time, however, the evidence was not conclusive, and later investigations have only deepened the uncertainty. In February 1898, the Maine exploded and sank, killing more than 250 crew members. A U.S. naval inquiry soon afterward suggested that an external mine might have detonated under the ship, which fit neatly with the idea of Spanish treachery. Newspapers presented this as near fact, and public anger swelled, but Spanish officials denied responsibility, and no direct proof of sabotage was ever produced. Decades later, new investigations revisited the wreck. Some experts argued that the damage pattern was consistent with an internal explosion in the coal bunkers, a known hazard on ships of that era when coal dust and heat could ignite. Others defended the original mine theory. To this day, historians generally agree that we do not know for certain what caused the blast. The disaster was quickly folded into a narrative of deliberate attack, but the rush to blame Spain outpaced the available evidence. The Maine sinking helped justify war, even as its true cause remained unresolved. 67. The Panama Canal was built mostly by Americans alone. The popular image shows American engineers and workers bravely conquering the jungle, carving a canal through Panama by sheer Yankee ingenuity and determination. While American engineering expertise and funding were important, the labor story is far more international, and much of it rests on the shoulders of people who rarely appear in the celebratory version. Before the United States even took over, the French had attempted a canal in the 1880s, employing tens of thousands of workers, many from the Caribbean. Disease, mismanagement, and financial collapse doomed that effort. When the U.S. acquired the project in the early 1900s, officials turned again to Caribbean labor. Tens of thousands of men from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, and other islands traveled to the canal zone for work. They dug, blasted, hauled, and maintained the vast machinery under intense heat and heavy rain. The labor system was segregated. Workers were divided into gold roll and silver roll categories. Americans and some Europeans were on the gold roll with higher pay and better housing. Caribbean and other non-white workers were placed on the silver roll, paid less, and housed in barracks with fewer amenities. Jim Crow practices extended into the canal zone, shaping everything from pay scales to schools and hospitals. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever were reduced through public health campaigns, but the daily work remained grueling and dangerous. When the canal finally opened in 1914, speeches and photographs highlighted American officials and engineers, while the vast multinational workforce, especially Black Caribbean laborers, faded into the background of the story. 68. Women gained rights only after 1920. The year 1920, when the 19th Amendment prohibited states from denying the vote based on sex, is often treated as a sudden transformation, as if women had been politically invisible before and fully empowered afterward. In reality, women had been organizing, influencing, and sometimes voting long before 1920, and the amendment did not instantly secure equal rights for all women. In the 19th century, women took part in abolitionism, temperance, and a wide range of reform movements. They petitioned legislatures, addressed public meetings, and built organizations that shaped national debates. Some Western territories and states granted women the right to vote decades before the federal amendment. Wyoming Territory did so in 1869, Utah in 1870, Colorado in 1893, and others followed. Women served on school boards, voted in municipal elections, and held certain local offices, wielding real, if limited, political power. Married women gradually won the right to own property, control wages, and sign contracts in their own names, thanks to a patchwork of state laws. After 1920, the right to vote on paper did not translate into easy access for everyone. Many Black women in the South, like Black men, were blocked by poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation until voting rights reforms in the 1960s. Native American women and men were often not recognized as citizens until the 1920s and beyond, and some states delayed their participation in voting even later. Asian American women faced barriers tied to immigration and citizenship restrictions. The story of women's rights is not a single leap in 1920, but a long, uneven struggle before and after that date, involving many kinds of activism and many different communities. 69. The Progressive Era fixed political corruption cleanly and completely. High school outlines sometimes present the early 20th century as a tidy sequence: corruption and boss rule in the Gilded Age, followed by wise reformers who cleaned house with new laws, regulations, and good government measures that put everything right. Progressives did push through major reforms. They supported direct primaries, initiatives and referendums, civil service exams, and antitrust laws aimed at breaking up monopolies. Journalists exposed urban graft and unsafe factories, prompting food and drug regulations and workplace protections. At the local level, some city machines lost power as commission governments and city managers were introduced. Yet these changes did not eliminate corruption, nor were they neutral in their effects. Some reforms made it harder for working-class immigrants and people of color to exert influence. Voter registration rules and literacy requirements, framed as tools against fraud, could selectively disenfranchise certain groups. Regulatory agencies sometimes grew close to the industries they were supposed to oversee, a pattern known as regulatory capture. Progressives also expanded state power in ways that were not always benign. They supported compulsory schooling and public health measures that could be used to police poor communities. Some embraced eugenics, advocating for forced sterilizations and marriage restrictions under the banner of scientific improvement. The Progressive Era did curb some abuses and modernize government in important ways. It also preserved hierarchies, created new tools for social control, and left many inequities intact. The story is less about corruption being cleanly fixed, and more about a shifting landscape where power took new forms. 70. World War I began American global leadership overnight. It is tempting to view U.S. entry into World War I in 1917 as the moment when a quiet, inward-focused nation suddenly stepped onto the world stage as a major power. In truth, the United States had been expanding its reach for decades before the first troops arrived in Europe. By the late 19th century, American businesses were deeply involved in international trade, selling manufactured goods and buying raw materials around the globe. The country had already asserted control over vast territories on the continent, from the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, after wars, treaties, and dispossession of native nations. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked another outward turn, resulting in U.S. control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, along with a long influence over Cuba. Naval bases and coaling stations dotted strategic points, and the building of the Panama Canal further extended American strategic reach into both the Atlantic and Pacific. Diplomats and bankers promoted dollar diplomacy, using loans and financial leverage to shape policies in Latin America and beyond. When the United States entered World War I, it did so as a country already intertwined with global finance and trade. American banks had lent heavily to the Allies, and U.S. factories were supplying weapons, food, and equipment. The war accelerated trends already underway. The United States emerged as a key creditor nation, its navy more active, its diplomats more involved in treaty negotiations. But none of this appeared suddenly. World War I did not create American global influence from nothing. It amplified and revealed patterns of expansion and engagement that had been building for decades. 71. The United States entered World War I only for idealism. The familiar story is that America stayed above the fray until 1917, then nobly entered the war to make the world safe for democracy, moved mainly by outrage over German behavior and a sudden burst of moral clarity. President Woodrow Wilson did use that language, and genuine idealism played a role, but it was never the whole picture. For almost 3 years, the United States tried to remain neutral while trading with all sides. In practice, economic ties leaned heavily toward Britain and France. American banks extended vast loans to the Allies. American factories sold them weapons, food, and supplies. If the Allies lost, those debts might never be repaid. German unrestricted submarine warfare also mattered. Attacks on merchant ships, including ones carrying Americans, turned public opinion. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, and later renewed submarine campaigns, made neutrality harder to defend. Intelligence intercepts, like the Zimmermann telegram, suggested Germany was willing to encourage conflict on American soil by seeking a Mexican alliance. Strategic considerations joined moral ones. Leaders feared a Europe dominated by a hostile power that could threaten trade routes and political balance. Wilson envisioned a post-war order with the United States at the table, shaping peace through a League of Nations. Going to war opened that possibility. The decision to enter World War I came from a mix of ideals, security concerns, financial interests, and calculations about America's future place in the world, not from pure moral impulse alone. 72. Trench warfare defined the entire American World War I experience. When we picture Americans in World War I, we tend to imagine endless muddy trenches, frozen lines of barbed wire, and soldiers going over the top into machine gun fire, as if that was the only environment where they fought. Trenches were real and important. When American troops arrived in France in large numbers in 1918, they joined an Allied front that had already dug in across hundreds of miles. Training and early deployments often involved trench sectors, observation posts, and raids across no man's land. But the American Expeditionary Forces entered the war late, in a phase when strategy was shifting away from static stalemate toward more mobile operations. U.S. units participated in major offensives like St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, which involved movement through forests, villages, and rolling terrain as well as trench lines. Some fighting took place in open fields, ravines, and shattered towns, with artillery, tanks, and aircraft playing growing roles. Americans also served far behind the front, managing ports, railroads, depots, and hospitals that fed the Allied war machine. Engineers built roads and bridges. Medical teams battled influenza as well as wounds. African American labor battalions performed vital work unloading ships and moving supplies. Not every soldier spent his time in a frontline trench, and not every battle followed the same pattern. Trench warfare marked the conflict deeply, but the American experience included a mixture of static defense, rapid offensives, support roles, and a brief but intense exposure to a war that had already evolved by the time they arrived. 73. The Roaring Twenties made everyone wealthy and carefree. Popular images turned the 1920s into a non-stop party of jazz clubs, flapper dresses, sleek cars, and glittering city lights, as if the whole country suddenly became prosperous and modern at once. In some places and for some people, the decade did bring rising incomes, consumer goods, and a sense of breaking with the past. Urban middle-class families bought radios, electric appliances, and mass-produced clothing on installment plans. Movies and advertising created a shared culture of glamour and possibility. Yet prosperity was uneven and often fragile. Farmers in much of the country struggled with low crop prices and heavy debt after wartime demand collapsed. Many never shared in the boom at all. Industrial workers faced fluctuating employment, anti-union campaigns, and wages that did not always keep pace with profits. Racial inequality remained stark. Black Americans who migrated to northern cities sometimes found better jobs and communities like Harlem's cultural scene, but they also met segregation, crowded housing, and occasional violence. Native Americans and many Mexican American and Asian American communities lived far from the bright lights of the supposed Roaring Age, facing discrimination and limited opportunities. Women who gained new public roles often still shouldered traditional expectations at home. Behind the optimism, consumer credit expanded, stock speculation grew, and economic imbalances built up quietly. By 1929, when the market crashed, it became clear that the Roaring Twenties had rested on a narrow foundation. The decade brought real change, but it did not lift everyone into carefree abundance. 74. Prohibition was a complete nationwide failure from day one. The usual story makes Prohibition sound like an instant, comic disaster. The moment alcohol was banned in 1920, everyone ignored the law, speakeasies popped up on every corner, and the whole experiment collapsed under the weight of hypocrisy and organized crime. There is truth in the tales of bootleggers and gangsters. Prohibition did encourage illegal markets, corruption, and violence in some cities. Enforcement was uneven and often underfunded. Yet the impact on drinking patterns was more complex than a simple failure. In the early years, overall alcohol consumption dropped significantly compared to pre-war levels. Many people did stop drinking or cut back, either out of respect for the law, reduced availability, or changing social norms. Some families saw fewer paychecks vanish in saloons. Public health statistics suggest declines in alcohol-related diseases and certain types of accidents. Over time, however, illegal supply chains adapted. Smuggling networks and home distilling expanded. Urban nightlife adjusted, and enforcement became a constant contest between authorities and those finding ways around the rules. Rural and small-town communities sometimes supported the law more strongly than big cities did, creating regional divides. The 18th Amendment did not simply fail or succeed. It reshaped patterns of drinking, crime, and law enforcement in uneven ways over 13 years. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it was not because nothing had changed, but because the costs, contradictions, and unintended consequences eventually outweighed the perceived benefits for most Americans. 75. The stock market crash alone caused the Great Depression. Many narratives begin the Great Depression with a single dramatic moment, the stock market collapse of October 1929, as if everything was fine until a bad week on Wall Street suddenly plunged the nation into despair. The crash was a serious shock, wiping out paper wealth and undermining confidence, but it struck an economy that already had underlying weaknesses. Income and wealth were highly concentrated. Many families could not afford the very goods that factories were producing in such quantity. Farmers had endured years of low prices and debt. International trade and finance were fragile, partly because of war debts and reparations left over from World War I. When the market fell, banks were exposed. Many had invested in stocks or made risky loans. As fear spread, depositors rushed to withdraw their savings. Bank failures cascaded through the early 1930s, destroying savings and reducing credit for businesses and consumers. Policy responses often deepened the downturn. The Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to contract instead of expanding it, making credit scarcer and deflation worse. Protective tariffs, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, triggered retaliatory measures abroad, shrinking global trade. Unemployment climbed as firms cut production and wages. The depression that unfolded was the result of multiple interacting factors: structural imbalances, financial panic, policy mistakes, and global linkages. The stock market crash was a dramatic early chapter, but it was not the sole cause, nor was the crisis limited to investors. Its roots reached into farms, factories, banks, and living rooms across the country and beyond. 76. The New Deal ended the Great Depression by itself. A common version of the story presents Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal as a single, decisive cure, a set of programs that swiftly pulled the United States out of economic freefall and restored prosperity. The New Deal did transform government's role in daily life. It created jobs programs that put millions to work, building roads, parks, schools, and dams. It established Social Security, banking reforms, deposit insurance, and new rules for the stock market. It offered relief to the unemployed and support to farmers. These measures helped stabilize a desperate situation, reduced suffering, and restored some confidence. But they did not fully end the Depression. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s, though better than at the worst depths. Economic growth returned unevenly, and when the government cut spending in 1937, the economy slipped back, showing how fragile recovery still was. Racial and regional inequalities persisted. Many black workers and agricultural laborers were excluded or underserved by key programs. What finally brought full employment and a surge in industrial output was the massive mobilization for World War II. Defense spending poured into factories and shipyards. Millions of men entered the armed forces, and women moved into industrial jobs. The wartime economy pushed production to new heights and soaked up idle capacity. The New Deal laid important foundations: safety nets, regulations, infrastructure. It cushioned the blow and reshaped expectations about government responsibility. The lifting of the Great Depression, however, came from a combination of those reforms and the extraordinary temporary demands of global war. 77 Dust Bowl migrants all came from Oklahoma. Popular culture has fixed the image of the Dust Bowl refugee as an Okie, a family fleeing a parched Oklahoma farm in an overloaded truck, heading west to California's fields and orchards. Oklahoma did suffer terribly in the 1930s, and many migrants did come from there. But the Dust Bowl was a wider environmental and economic disaster that crossed state lines. Years of drought, high winds, and farming practices that left topsoil exposed combined to create severe dust storms across large parts of the southern plains. Regions of Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico also experienced crop failures, soil erosion, and farm foreclosures. Families from these states joined Oklahomans on the roads, seeking work and more stable conditions elsewhere. In California and other destinations, locals often used Okie as a blanket term for migrants from the entire region, regardless of their actual state of origin. Migrants found seasonal farm labor, government camps, and sometimes hostility from established residents who feared competition and change. Some eventually settled into new communities beyond agriculture, working in factories or construction as the economy shifted. The Dust Bowl migration was not a single stream from one state, but a broad movement of people driven by intertwined forces: environmental mismanagement, weather patterns, falling commodity prices, and the wider pressures of the Great Depression. Reducing it to Oklahoma alone obscures the shared experience of hardship and adaptation that stretched across the central United States. 78. Pearl Harbor completely united America without dissent. The story usually goes that on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked, and instantly every American stood shoulder to shoulder, perfectly united in purpose without division or conflict. The attack did produce a powerful wave of anger, grief, and resolve. Isolationist politicians who had resisted involvement in the war quickly voted for declarations of war. War bonds sold, recruitment offices filled, but unity was never absolute. There had been deep debates before Pearl Harbor about foreign policy, and those arguments did not simply disappear. Some Americans still questioned strategy, priorities, and the extent of mobilization. Political disagreements continued over issues like price controls, labor rights, and civil liberties. Prejudice intensified rather than vanished. Anti-Japanese racism surged, targeting both immigrants and American-born citizens. German and Italian Americans faced suspicion in some communities. Conscientious objectors struggled with legal and social pressure. Strikes and labor disputes occurred even during the war. Pearl Harbor created a broad consensus to fight, but beneath that surface, the usual tensions of a diverse society continued to shape how the war was experienced and remembered. 79. Japanese-American internment was a military necessity proven by evidence. The official justification at the time claimed that removing more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, two-thirds of them citizens, was essential to prevent espionage and sabotage. Military orders spoke of security and necessity, yet investigations before and during the war repeatedly found no widespread threat. Intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, reported that most Japanese Americans were loyal or posed no special danger. These findings were downplayed or ignored. Instead, long-standing racism, economic jealousy, and wartime fear did much of the work. West Coast politicians, business interests, and newspapers had pushed anti-Asian policies for decades. Pearl Harbor gave them a new language: national security for old prejudices. Families were forced from their homes with little time to prepare, allowed to take only what they could carry. Farms, shops, and houses were sold off at a loss or taken over by neighbors. No proven cases of domestic sabotage by Japanese Americans were uncovered. Decades later, a federal commission concluded that the internment resulted from race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, not from solid military evidence. The government eventually issued a formal apology and paid limited redress, but the human cost could never be fully repaid. 80. D-Day was the decisive turning point that won World War II alone. June 6, 1944, has become a symbol of Allied victory, with images of soldiers landing on Normandy beaches presented as the single, decisive moment that broke Nazi power. D-Day was indeed crucial. It opened a massive Western front, allowed Allied forces to liberate France, and put direct pressure on Germany from another direction. The bravery and loss were real, but the war's outcome did not hinge only on that day or that theater. For years before D-Day, the Soviet Union had been fighting enormous battles on the Eastern Front, absorbing and inflicting staggering casualties. Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long Soviet advance westward had already shattered much of the German army. Combined bombing campaigns from Britain and the United States had hammered German industry and infrastructure. In North Africa and Italy, earlier campaigns had drawn off men and resources. In the Pacific, the United States and its allies were engaged in a separate, grinding struggle against Japan, from Midway to Guadalcanal to island campaigns across vast distances. D-Day was one piece, an important one of a much larger global war. The defeat of the Axis came from the combined efforts of many nations, many fronts, and years of brutal fighting, not from a single heroic day on one set of beaches. 81. The atomic bombs were the only reason Japan surrendered. The common narrative is stark. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was shocked into submission, and the war ended solely because of nuclear terror. The bombs were horrific. They killed tens of thousands instantly and many more through radiation and injuries. They signaled a new and terrifying level of destructive power. But they were not the only factor Japanese leaders considered. By August 1945, Japan's cities had already suffered months of conventional bombing. The navy was largely destroyed. Supplies were scarce. Yet elements of the leadership still argued for continuing the war, hoping to secure better surrender terms. On August 8, between the two bombings, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held territories in Manchuria and elsewhere. For Japanese strategists who had counted on Moscow as a possible mediator, this was a devastating blow. Suddenly, they faced defeat from two directions and the prospect of Soviet occupation. Cabinet discussions in Tokyo weighed both the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry. Diaries and later testimonies show that the fear of a divided, occupied Japan strongly influenced decisions. The emperor's unprecedented radio address announcing surrender reflected a complex set of calculations: military exhaustion, destruction from both atomic and conventional attacks, diplomatic dead ends, and the shock of a new enemy entering the war. 82. Rosie the Riveter represented a permanent wartime transformation for all women workers. The familiar image of Rosie, sleeves rolled up and flexed arm raised, suggests that World War II simply opened the factory gates and permanently remade gender roles in the workplace. The war did bring new opportunities. Millions of women entered paid work or moved into better-paying industrial jobs. They built planes, ships, and munitions. They operated heavy machinery and managed complex assembly lines. For some, it was the first time earning their own wages outside domestic service or agriculture. Yet the transformation was never as universal or as lasting as the poster suggests. Many jobs were still segregated by race and gender. Black women and other women of color often faced the double barriers of discrimination and limited access to skilled positions, even in wartime industries. When the war ended and men returned, many women were laid off, pressured back into lower-paying work, or encouraged to focus on home and family. Propaganda shifted from "we can do it" to celebrating domesticity. Some women did manage to stay in industrial or professional roles and built on their wartime experience, but others lost ground. The Rosie era planted seeds of change and showed what women could do in a national emergency, yet the post-war period saw a partial retreat. The story is less about a clean break and more about an uneven, contested evolution of women's work over decades. 83. The Cold War was always a simple battle of good versus evil. It is often described as a clear moral showdown, freedom-loving United States versus totalitarian Soviet Union, with every conflict around the world neatly fitting into that frame. Ideology mattered. American leaders did see themselves as defending democracy and capitalism. Soviet leaders claimed to speak for socialism and anti-imperialism. Human rights abuses, censorship, and repression in the Soviet bloc were real, and so were coups, covert operations, and support for dictators on the American side. But the Cold War was also shaped by older patterns of power politics, regional rivalries, and local struggles that did not always line up neatly with big slogans. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, independence movements and civil wars often had deep roots in colonial history and internal inequalities. Superpowers sometimes backed one side or another, less because of shared values and more because of strategic location, resources, or fear of losing influence. Allies on both sides could be authoritarian or democratic, depending on circumstance. Leaders in smaller countries were not always passive pieces on a chessboard. They used superpower competition to pursue their own agendas. The Cold War mixed ideals, fears, and practical calculations. Calling it purely a clash of good and evil simplifies a long, complicated period when many people found themselves caught between rival systems that both claimed moral high ground. 84. McCarthy personally uncovered most communist spies in government. Popular memory turns Senator Joseph McCarthy into the central, almost heroic or monstrous figure of the early Cold War hunt for subversion, as if he single-handedly exposed a vast network of spies embedded in Washington. In reality, there had been genuine espionage cases before and during his rise, investigated quietly by the FBI, congressional committees, and security agencies. Some spies were found and prosecuted without McCarthy's involvement. McCarthy, a relatively obscure senator, catapulted to fame in 1950 by waving lists of alleged communists in the State Department, numbers that shifted and names he rarely substantiated publicly. His hearings and speeches relied heavily on innuendo, guilt by association, and attacks on reputations. Careers were damaged, people lost jobs, or were blacklisted on the basis of tenuous connections or old political activities. While the broader Red Scare climate included loyalty programs, Hollywood blacklists, and various investigations, McCarthy's role was to amplify and dramatize the fear, not to carefully build solid cases. Later reviews of his claims found many to be exaggerated, inaccurate, or entirely unsupported. His influence declined after the televised Army McCarthy hearings showed his methods to a wide audience, and the Senate formally censured him. The history of Cold War security concerns is larger than one man, and McCarthy's legacy rests more on the harm caused by reckless accusation than on the patient uncovering of real spies. 85. The 1950s were a calm golden age for everyone. The storybook version shows new suburbs, shiny cars, and smiling families, as if the whole decade was a peaceful, equal, prosperous oasis. There was real prosperity for many white, middle-class Americans: rising wages, home ownership, consumer goods, and a sense of stability after depression and war. But that golden age was not shared evenly. Segregation was still law across the South and lived reality in much of the North. Black families were often excluded from mortgages and new subdivisions. Women were pushed toward narrow roles as housewives, even if many had worked during the war or needed income. LGBTQ people faced criminalization and deep stigma. Underneath the calm surface lay Cold War anxiety, nuclear fears, and strict cultural conformity. The 1950s did bring comfort for some, but it coexisted with rigid limits, unequal access, and pressures that many quietly struggled against. 86. Brown v. Board of Education ended school segregation quickly. The Supreme Court's 1954 decision is often remembered as a clean line. One day, segregated schools were legal, and the next, they weren't, and integration followed. The ruling did declare legally mandated segregation in public schools unconstitutional. But the court's follow-up language, calling for desegregation with all deliberate speed, gave room for delay. Many Southern officials resisted openly. Some school districts closed public schools rather than integrate. Others used token measures, admitting a tiny number of black students while keeping most schools effectively segregated. White citizens' councils formed to organize opposition. Federal enforcement was uneven and often slow. In places like Little Rock in 1957, black students needed National Guard escorts just to enter school. Even decades later, housing patterns, local policies, and funding disparities kept many schools effectively separated by race. Brown was a landmark, but the reality of desegregation unfolded slowly, unevenly, and with constant struggle. 87. Rosa Parks was just a tired seamstress who acted spontaneously. The familiar image has her as an ordinary woman whose feet simply hurt too much one day, leading to an unplanned act of defiance. She was indeed a working seamstress, and she was tired. But she was also a seasoned activist with deep roots in civil rights work. For years, she had served as secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. She investigated cases of racial violence and sexual assault, including attacks on black women that rarely made headlines. She had attended trainings on nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Folk School. She thought carefully about strategy and risk. When she refused to give up her seat in 1955, it was not her first confrontation with bus segregation, and local organizers quickly recognized the moment's potential. The Montgomery bus boycott that followed was meticulously organized. Park's quiet courage mattered, and so did the long, deliberate groundwork behind it. 88. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech was his entire message. School lessons often reduce him to a single day in 1963 and a single line about judging people by the content of their character, as if his work began and ended there. In reality, King's public life stretched across years of organizing, arrests, and speeches that touched many issues. He spoke about voting rights and segregation, but also about labor and economic justice. He supported striking sanitation workers in Memphis. He called for a poor people's campaign to demand jobs, housing, and basic security for all. In his later years, he became an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, linking militarism abroad to poverty and racism at home. He talked about the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism as interconnected problems. The dream at the Lincoln Memorial was important, but it was part of a much broader, often controversial challenge to American structures of power. 89. The civil rights movement was entirely nonviolent and unified. The usual picture shows a single, harmonious movement, everyone following the same philosophy of peaceful protest from start to finish. Nonviolent tactics, sit-ins, marches, boycotts were central and powerful. Many leaders, including King, grounded their approach in Christian ethics and Gandhian strategy. At the same time, the movement contained real debates and divisions. Younger activists in groups like SNCC sometimes pushed for faster, more confrontational approaches. Local organizers in places like Mississippi or Alabama had to weigh nonviolence against the reality of murderous violence from white supremacists and often limited federal protection. Some communities discussed armed self-defense at home while supporting nonviolent protests in public. Figures like Malcolm X and later the Black Panther Party criticized what they saw as over-reliance on appeals to white conscience. The movement was not a single smooth line, but a complex web of local struggles, disagreements, experiments, and evolving ideas about how to win freedom and dignity. 90. The 1960s counterculture represented most young Americans. Cultural memory sometimes turns the decade into a blur of hippies, protests, long hair, and radical politics, as if nearly every young person joined in. There were real shifts: music, fashion, campus activism, and new conversations about war, race, gender, and sexuality. Student protests and anti-war marches did draw large crowds, and some communities embraced alternative lifestyles and experiments in communal living. But many young Americans lived more conventional lives. They went to work, to church, to the military, and to traditional colleges without joining protests. Some actively opposed the counterculture, seeing it as disrespectful or dangerous. Others were simply busy supporting families, paying bills, and navigating everyday responsibilities. Polls at the time showed significant support among young people for existing institutions and for the Vietnam War, especially early on. The 1960s were not a single youth rebellion, but a decade when visible change and quieter continuity existed side by side. 91. The Vietnam War was escalated suddenly by one single president. It is tempting to point to one administration, often Lyndon Johnson, and imagine a single dramatic decision that turned a small conflict into a large, disastrous war. In reality, U.S. involvement deepened step by step over many years and several presidents. Under Truman and Eisenhower, the United States provided funds and support to French efforts in Indochina, and later to the government of South Vietnam. Under Kennedy, the number of American advisors and special forces grew, and U.S. commitment to the regime in Saigon tightened. Johnson oversaw major escalation after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents in 1964, sending combat troops and authorizing sustained bombing. Nixon inherited a huge war and expanded fighting into Cambodia and Laos, even as he spoke of Vietnamization and withdrawal. Each administration made choices that increased involvement, often believing they were containing communism and preserving credibility. The war emerged from a long chain of decisions rather than a single, sudden leap. 92. The moon landing instantly ended the space race. The image is clean and satisfying. In 1969, Americans land on the moon, plant a flag, win, and the competition is over. The reality is more drawn out. Apollo 11 was a huge symbolic victory, but both the United States and the Soviet Union kept investing in space as a stage for technology, prestige, and long-term strategy. The US flew multiple Apollo missions after 1969, experimented with Skylab, and eventually built the reusable space shuttle. The Soviets expanded their own space station program, refined long-duration missions, and developed new launch systems. Satellites for communication, weather, and spying kept advancing on both sides. Even after the formal Cold War rivalry cooled, space remained a quiet arena for competition in GPS, missile technology, and planetary probes. The moon landing was a milestone, not a finish line. The race simply changed shape, moving from dramatic firsts to less visible contests of endurance, capability, and influence. 93. Watergate was only a minor burglary story. It can sound like a small crime with an oddly grand name. Some men broke into an office at the Watergate complex, they got caught, and it embarrassed a president. But Watergate was never just about one break-in. The burglary exposed a much broader pattern of abuses, including illegal wiretaps, political dirty tricks, hush money, and efforts to use federal agencies to punish opponents. As investigations unfolded, it became clear that top officials had tried to obstruct justice, destroy evidence, and mislead Congress and the public. Secret tapes made in the Oval Office revealed the president's involvement in the cover-up. The scandal led to multiple resignations, criminal convictions, and, ultimately, Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974 to avoid almost certain impeachment and removal. Watergate triggered a constitutional crisis that tested whether the president was truly subject to law. It also led to reforms in campaign finance, oversight, and transparency. A third-rate burglary opened a window onto much deeper problems. 94. The 1970s were only an era of decline. The decade is often remembered as a low point: oil shocks, inflation, lines at gas stations, political disillusionment after Vietnam and Watergate, rising crime, and a sense of things falling apart. Those troubles were real, and many families felt them directly. Yet the 1970s were also a time of important reforms and new protections. The modern environmental movement took shape, leading to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and key laws on clean air, clean water, and endangered species. Consumer protections expanded, from product safety regulations to clearer information on food and drugs. The decade saw major advances in women's rights, including Title IX for educational equality and greater workplace opportunities. Disability rights advocates pushed for accessibility and anti-discrimination measures, laying groundwork for later laws. The 1970s brought energy anxiety and economic strain, but they also produced lasting rules and institutions that shaped health, safety, and rights in everyday American life. 95. Ronald Reagan single-handedly ended the Cold War. The popular version gives one leader center stage. Reagan appears, ramps up defense spending, delivers tough speeches, and the Soviet Union collapses as a direct result. His presidency was certainly part of the story. He did push a large military buildup and propose systems like Star Wars. He also shifted toward negotiation later in his terms, signing arms control agreements with Mikhail Gorbachev. But the end of the Cold War grew out of many layers. Earlier leaders, including Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, had already created a landscape of deterrence, alliances, and détente. Inside the Soviet Union, economic stagnation, political rigidity, and costly wars put immense pressure on the system. Gorbachev's own reforms, glasnost and perestroika, opened doors that could not easily be shut. Eastern European movements challenged communist rule from below. Reagan was one important actor among many, not a lone hero pulling a single lever that ended decades of global rivalry. 96. The internet was invented overnight by private entrepreneurs. It can sound like a sudden miracle of the 1990s. A few brilliant business founders create a website, a browser, or a startup, and the modern internet appears fully formed. In reality, the web rests on decades of quieter, publicly funded research and collaborative engineering. In the late 1960s, the U.S. Department of Defense's ARPA supported ARPANET, an experimental network connecting universities and research labs. Computer scientists developed packet switching, protocols, and ways for different machines to talk to each other. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers designed TCP/IP, the foundational language of the Internet, and gradually linked more networks into a growing backbone. Many key technologies, email, domain names, routing systems, emerged in academic and government environments. Private companies later built commercial services, hardware, and user-friendly interfaces on top of this shared infrastructure. The Internet was less a single invention than a long, cumulative project blending public investment, open standards, and later, entrepreneurial energy. 97. 9/11 created all modern American security policy from nothing. The attacks in 2001 did mark a sharp turning point, leading to new agencies, wars, and visible rules at airports and borders. It can feel as though an entirely new security world sprang up overnight. But many of the ideas and patterns had earlier roots. The Cold War had already produced extensive intelligence networks, covert interventions abroad, and domestic surveillance programs, some of which were exposed in the 1970s. The war on drugs had expanded policing powers, asset seizures, and militarized tactics. Legal tools for emergency authority and foreign intervention were on the books long before 2001. After 9/11, these strands were reassembled and intensified around terrorism, with new technologies and broader mandates. The Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, and expanded watch lists built on existing structures rather than appearing from a blank slate. The shock of 9/11 accelerated changes, but the habits of surveillance and intervention had been developing for decades. 98. The United States has always steadily expanded democracy without reversals. The story often taught is one of smooth upward progress, each generation adding more rights, more inclusion, more votes, as if the line only moved forward. There were important expansions. Property and tax requirements for white men fell in the 1800s. The Civil War amendments formally ended slavery and granted citizenship and voting protections. Women gained the vote nationwide in 1920. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 attacked legal barriers that had blocked black citizens from the polls. Yet there were also sharp setbacks and periods of contraction. After Reconstruction, Southern states imposed literacy tests, poll taxes, and terror to strip black citizens of effective political power. Native Americans were long excluded from citizenship and voting. Asian immigrants faced naturalization bans. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new voter ID rules, purges of voter rolls, and reduced polling places have again shaped who can easily participate. American democracy has grown over time, but its boundaries have repeatedly narrowed and widened through conflict, backlash, and renewed struggle. 99. American history follows a simple path of constant progress. It's comforting to imagine a straight line that always goes up, from colonies to revolution, from slavery to freedom, from discrimination to equality, each step an improvement on the last, each decade a little better than the one before. The real story is quieter and more tangled. Progress comes in bursts, then stalls, then sometimes slides backward. The end of slavery was followed by black codes and Jim Crow. The promise of Reconstruction gave way to lynching, disenfranchisement, and segregation enforced by law and violence. The New Deal expanded social protections, but often excluded domestic and agricultural workers, many of them black and brown. The gains of early labor movements faced crackdowns, Red Scares, and anti-union campaigns. The victories of the Civil Rights era met with busing battles, mass incarceration, and new forms of exclusion. For every expansion of voting rights, there have been new rules, barriers, and subtle obstacles. For every reform, there are loopholes, compromises, and unintended harms. Yet the line isn't only downward either. People organize, push, and reopen possibilities that seemed closed. Old ideas are revisited. Forgotten movements are remembered. Rights that were narrowed can be widened again. American history is best understood as layers laid over one another. Ideals announced, betrayed, reclaimed, and revised, often by people who were left out of the earlier versions. It is a story of gains that require maintenance, of freedoms that can erode if neglected, of promises that remain only partly fulfilled. Not a straight staircase of improvement, but a winding path with switchbacks and side trails where progress is real but never automatic, and where each generation must decide which direction to walk.